Welcome to Portals of Perception, where we ask and inquire at the edge of what we know to explore and find new perceptions. Perceptions about this time and about where does the future come from. Today we are exploring with Jessica Wapner, and we are interested with Jessica to inquire about the trace of touch and the place of touch in healing and in medicine. And Jessica, will you introduce yourself, please, and share a little bit about how you came to this inquiry about touch and some of your work in journalism and the books that you published?
Sure. So, hello, my name is Jessica Wapner, and I work as a science journalist. That's work that I've been doing for about 13 years. And I've written for many different magazines, Scientific American, The Atlantic, New York Magazine, Wired, The New Yorker, and several other places. And I've also written 2 books under my own name and also ghostwritten a book. So my first book, The Philadelphia Chromosome, which came out in 2013, told the story behind a breakthrough cancer drug, looking at way back in time at how the science behind it was uncovered and the ups and downs of dealing with the pharmaceutical industry and patients and everything else that went into creating this drug. And I also ghost wrote a book on food allergy research that came out in 2020. And my third book, Wall Disease, looks at the psychological toll of living up against a border. So looking at border regions around the world and the ways in which people who are living right at those places are coping, what they're suffering from and how they're coping with the unique problems attached to these specific places.
So could you synthesize what is wall disease? What is the impact that you have discovered in this inquiry?
So it's multidimensional. It expresses itself in different ways, such as the feeling of being oppressed. When you see a wall near you every day, or even steel barriers that you can see through, a sense of, as one person I spoke with put it to me, that your life is being stopped here. That's the end. There's a lot of othering that border walls create, this sense that the people on the other side are the other. And so in that sense, you can understand wall disease as it's not just those who you might understand as being oppressed, right? Who we can visibly, physically see are oppressed in terms of their financial status, the danger that they live in. But anyone who feels a sense of fear about what's on the other side of the wall suffers from some form of wall disease. So where there's a wall separating rich from poor, wall disease is on both sides. There's also a lot of depression, which has been measured. It's not just a kind of, it's not just like a theory. There's people who have seen that there's higher rates of antidepressant prescriptions clustered around people living near border walls, for example. These regions are often also forgotten areas, and so people end up having to engage in quite dangerous livelihoods because governments, for whatever reason, tend to not pay much attention to these areas, to do with probably their constituency isn't to be found there. So yeah, it's very multidimensional. What I added up from it is that certainly we all carry a little bit of wall disease in us, because we all have a bit of a sense of that borders between nations are real, and the fear of, you can look at the fear of what happens if you lose your passport, and how much we buy special articles of clothing to keep our passports safe, and we freak out if we lose them. Is actually from my adding up a little example of wall disease.
And the premise is, even if we don't live right next to a wall, we've experienced many other kind of walls throughout our life and experience. So how did you come from that to the inquiry that centers on touch and the place of touch in healing and medicine?
That's a good question. I was trying to remember how I first started wondering about touch. And I think I came across some research that was looking at what gentle touch does in the body. And it led me down a road of inquiry. That's what happens. It happens probably too much of having, wanting to pursue every curious thing that comes my way and turn it into an article. But I spoke with an editor about this interesting idea about touch and the need for touch. And I had looked at it from different angles in the world, of including, for example, people who are dying in a hospital and don't get touched, and how awful that is. And so the editor that I was speaking with was interested in that, and also interested in the whole world of wellness in general, and what is this thing we call wellness, and why do hospitals have wellness centers attached to them as this kind of appendage that is kind of part of the hospital, but not really part of the hospital exactly. And you have doctors who are speaking out with very skeptical perspectives against some of the practices that you find in wellness centers. And it really became apparent that this was a whole tangled knot that bared untangling.
Right. So obviously it has a socioeconomic side to the story, and it also has a historic and side and a scientific side to the story. So the multifaceted story. What drew me when I read one of the versions of the article information was that you've gone through historic trace. And I found the historic trace to be very illuminating, because it paints a picture that aligns with some of the inquiries that I'm propelled by in terms of the bigger inquiry of the human experience, and what can we learn about how we are different or the same when we look couple, 3, 4 centuries back, and when we look even further back into ancient times, obviously with the significance of appreciating what happened around the 1600 and the Enlightenment and the introduction of the scientific method and the great side of it, but also what I will dare say, the not so good side of it, or the shadow side of it, in terms of how it created a division in the human experience. So I became interested in how you tell the story, and perhaps you can lead us right to the beginning. If what's the earliest mention of touch in anything written or any document that we can trace to back in time, and how is touch being viewed at that time?
Right. Well, hard for me to know exactly, because the dates of history are, not always known. So, for example, you find references to ancient Egypt, and what does that mean exactly, since it stretched over so many years, millennia. So there are definitely references to the hands in ancient Egypt, for sure. There are references to the hands in ancient Greece, and in ancient China, and in Ayurvedic medicine, which is thousands of years old, coming out from India. So it seems that, from what I can piece together, that there are references to touch coming from all over the world, to do with the healing power of touch and the healing, what the hands are capable of doing.
You're referencing in the copy that you shared with me that in 2600 BC, Gilgamesh pronounced his best friend's death with the words, "I touch his heart, but it does not beat at all,"
Yes.
which reveals that they have had the awareness and the knowledge of the pulse, the heartbeat, and the capacity of sensing it and accessing it by touch.
Yeah, it's amazing to think of the whole, what knowledge is inherent in that statement, what you need to understand about the human body to know that if you feel a heart and it's not beating, what that signifies. And pulse is definitely the earliest, again, from what I can tell, are among the earliest uses of touch. In traditional Chinese medicine, of course, there's an incredible science to do with pulse taking and what you can tell about a person from their pulse, and the 9 different pulses that you can feel just in the wrist alone, and the art of that, and how many pulses you need to take to.
You're right that they have 26 categories of pulses, which is like letters in the alphabet, which made me very curious.
Interesting. I had not put that together. Wow. Yeah. That's a good one.
Yeah. So it's fascinating. The first thing that immediately brings to mind, so we're seeing right at back in ancient times, the recognition of the utility of touch, both as a diagnostic tool and then also as a healing tool, 2 different applications of touch as part of care or the awareness of health.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that probably, many people watching this have the reference of the laying on of hands. And that is something that dates back, it's as old as human life. From what I can tell, this notion of that the hands carry something, that you can do things with your hands. You can offer something with your hands. And you can, as you said, it's also diagnostic. You can read things, you can detect with your hands as well.
So this idea of laying on of hands, you trace back to ancient Egypt, and then is manifesting in the biblical story with Moses, you're writing, laying his hands on Joshua by way of transferring his power.
Yes.
And that's a long time before. You got to travel almost, I don't know, what is it, 600 or years or more to the idea of actually healing with your hands, which is apparent in the scripture with some of the phenomena accompanying the rise of Jesus and the miracles that he is able to perform. But you are tracing the significance of touch and of hands throughout all these stories, indicating that touch and hands were very important for people.
I loved the reference to, now I can't remember the names at the moment, I'm sorry, where someone is saying basically like, oh, you're healing with your hands. I want to do that. I'd like to be able to do that. But he's not, he's not a humble person. The person who's asking this, he's not a kind of enlightened religious person. And the response is, you can't just do it because you want to. It depends on, being right in yourself on the inside first. And that I thought was very interesting, because right there, it's linking that healing, whatever a person can do with their hands, is connected to what they're doing with their mind.
What else would you add to what you already offered in terms of the significance we are finding with people in ancient times in terms of their appreciation of the connection and the relationship between their mind, or what they're joined to, or the powers that are working through them, and this idea that the hands represents some kind of important or sacred power transferred through the hands. What else are you finding about that?
So I thought another really good example of that was that Hippocrates would do healings with his hands in the temple of Asclepios.
Mm-hmm.
And no matter who, what the temple it was dedicated to, the idea that you would do that in a temple, I thought was quite interesting. That there was just this connection between healing and religion. And I don't know that it would have even been called religion. It was the gods, or it was the higher powers that be, and that this was something that would work through you, not that you would be doing on your own necessarily. And of course, all the examples in the New Testament that we have from the life of Jesus were certainly, so much about connecting belief with healing.
So what happens then when you trace through time? I imagine not much activity or advancement through the Dark Ages, but what happens then as you go through the arc of time? I don't know if you found any further trace through the Roman Empire or beyond, or what's the next milestone in this trace?
Right. It's a great question, because there is this kind of very long stretch of time when, and it's partly to do with what a person can access over the internet, which is how I'm doing my research at the moment. I'm sure there are things to be found in, specialized libraries that aren't readily available, to do with the stretch of time between essentially 0 AD and the 1600s, let's say. But there's a point at which, during medieval time, there's a point at which the idea that the monarchs can heal gets introduced. So this man, Edward the Confessor, says a king can touch a person with a disease called scrofula, which was known more commonly as the king's evil. And it's a form of tuberculosis outside of the lungs, and it gives a person kind of patches. It's not very appealing looking. It's visible on the skin, and the thinking, the belief was that the king or the queen could touch a person and cause this king's evil to heal. And there is, I found it to be rather delightful accounts of this king or this queen healing people. There was there's actually like newspaper proclamations at the time saying, the queen will be offering healings up until she'll touch you up until Christmas, and it gets recorded as touches. This king touched 1,600 people on Easter Sunday, and after Christmas there will be no more touching until after the New Year. This was a thing that you would seek, and it would be marked with a coin. A person would be given a coin to take away. And because I think in the beginning, the person would stay on, behind castle walls until they were healed. And then presumably that became too much. And so they were given a coin to take with them instead.
So that pains that at that time, there are three qualities associated with touch. There is healing property associated with touch. There is some power transfer associated with touch, in this case, through the power of the royals and the king, the queen. And it is also viewed as a gift of some sort. So a very significant element.
Yeah.
Of the human experience. And what happens then as we come through to the 16th century and the Enlightenment? How is that changing the equation or not?
Well, so, and it's interesting. I hadn't thought of it this way before, that the whole king's touch thing also gives touch an air of authority.
Right.
That it gets associated with the authority figure in your life. That's the person who can offer this, that it's not just anyone who can do it, which I think becomes a theme throughout the centuries that follow. In the 1600s, so, there starts to be this whole life of wellness. Medicine becomes a practice. It starts the journey toward becoming the medicine that we know of today, what we recognize as medicine today. You could kind of trace back to, say, the 1600s, where something is trying to get formularized, but at the same time, there's no restriction. Anyone can be a doctor.
Well, really, with the rise of the scientific method and the scientific revolution.
Yes, absolutely. And there's this kind of interesting blend of like hodgepodge, like let's try this, let's try that, and bloodletting, of course, being, I think, one of the supreme examples that we have of a practice that held on for quite some time. And that it was the barber who did it.
Yeah.
You weren't going to the doctor for a bloodletting, and we have copious records of all of this, which is it's just fascinating. And you look back and you think, I think the prevalent viewpoint when we look back on those centuries of medicine is sort of like, oh my gosh, all that they didn't know. And there's almost a tendency to laugh at it or think it's ignorant. But then, as we'll talk about more, is the question of what then gets lost along the way as things become more formularized, more professional, more linked to the scientific method.
Well, and the scientific method and its rise is deeply associated with the idea of the capacity to measure things. And measurement enters the equation. We did not measure up until that time. So first we developed the capacity to measure. Now that we have the capacity to measure, we can measure the impact of whatever we do, and we can also introduce practices and repeatable practices and experiment and measure the results. So I'm intuiting, you've done the research, that the foundation of what we know as medicine today, with everything, has to, in the first place, be scientifically or empirically proven is traced back to that time. And the interest in the inquiry and the trace of touch, how is touch being treated in this transformative ecosystem where wellness and health and medicine are taken through that revolution of it's got to be measured and it's got to be repeatable. So how is touch being treated through that?
Well, it's one of the ways that it's being treated is as not necessarily as its own distinct thing, but as part of the bigger progress of medicine, or what's, the progress of a certain kind of medicine, right? Because we can define some of it as progress and some of it as not progress. Because of what gets lost along the way. So one example is the development of the thermometer, and what happens when you can take a person's temperature with a thermometer as opposed to with your hands, because of course that's what was done. There was no other way to take temperature. Then came the development of the stethoscope.
But by the way, just to pause on this for a minute, because I would venture to guess that is a lost art, that there were people who could actually take your temperature with their hand in a pretty accurate way, and probably that is not a skill that's very much available today, because you don't need to have that skill.
Yes. Yeah. And I think what happens is you start to see when those skills get lost, and instead you have the tools to do it, then what happens is you look back in time and think, oh, but it's not accurate. How can you tell anything from testing a pulse? Because it's not accurate. But to say that without having the skill of identifying those 26 categories, or, you're coming at it from assuming that because you're you should be able to check a pulse and know whatever there is to know, that it's not an art that needs to be developed. Same thing with feeling someone's forehead, and what you would then combine that with, right? By looking at everything else like we do, because of course parents know that you can check a child's head for fever and also put that together with how their eyes look and what their complexion is like. And, we do it all the time. We just somehow stop giving it credence when we enter the hospital doors.
And we are not romanticizing here the 16th century. Nobody is recommending that we go back to that time. We're simply openly inquiring.
Yeah, absolutely.
The upside and the other, perhaps concealed side of skills and capabilities lost because we've benefited so much from the advancement of technology, which is great. We're just looking at that in the fully most encompassing way we can. So what happens then as you proceed from that towards the 17th, 18th, 19th century? Industrial Revolution comes online and people are moving increasingly from agricultural experience into urban centers and industrialization, and all that is transforming the nature and the quality of life. And I'm venturing to guess also how we look at wellness and health. And through that, we're interested in that line of touch, how touch plays through that or not, whether it disappears, and if it disappears, then why?
Yeah. So much happens. Of course, it totally accelerates from this period on, where you have the thermometer, you have the stethoscope, you have things starting to become science-y, right? In terms of diagnosing diseases. You have the development of the field of nosology, which is the classification of diseases. And things are becoming more, less about your personal interpretation and more about a universal agreement that this symptom, this symptom, this symptom means this, and we treat it this way. And the hands are becoming less of a healing tool. No doctors are not laying on their hands to patients. That is not a thing that's going on in medicine. They will still diagnose. They'll palpate, press on the abdomen, press here, press there, but the hands have really become diagnostic tools at this point, exclusively in Western medicine. We're talking about, of course,
But is it the same with nurses, or nurses retain that capacity as part of their practice?
So that comes along in a little while in this trace of it. From my limited understanding of this, there's a lot more to understand. Is that?
But so let's just stay with what you described there. So you're describing we're getting empowered with technologies and tools, and doctors, the authority figures of health and wellness, retreat from the usage of touch, certainly as a healing property, and even on many aspects, retreating from using that as a diagnostic tool, because increasingly they are delegating that information to the various technologies that are coming online.
Yes, and I talked to several medical historians, and one of them, Jacqueline Duffin, how she explained it to me was that at this time, it used to be that a patient would be the one to say, "I'm sick. Help me because I'm sick. You have to help me," and which is almost it's almost a hard mindset to imagine that I can say I'm sick. Like, it's up to me to say that there's something wrong. I don't need you, doctor so-and-so, to confirm that. And that switches when, really the stethoscope being a big marking point in this time, and then the progression toward more and more technology, it's the doctor becomes the authority. And that was what interested me about this. The King's touch was like, right, there is this kind of thing through history of the person who has there is a person who has the capability to offer healing, and I put myself in your hands. And which is interesting. We say, I put myself in your hands. There's so much language to do with touch, like keep in touch. I mean, there's so much.
We lost touch. Yeah.
Can I contact you? I mean, it's, there's so much fascinating language around all of this, where you just from that alone, you think there's something else going on here, about our
the significance of touch in our shared experience, and how it permeates the language, in ways that are far beyond the idea of physical touch.
Yes, absolutely. It is just something that is, it leads me to think there's something about being human that is inextricably tied to something we discover about touch. And I don't know, is it about physical touch? Is it about something else? But there's something, we can't separate ourselves from it.
And of course, when we see a little baby, it's very hard to resist the temptation to want to touch them. And you wonder why. Why are we so attracted to touch the baby? What is it that actually we're so interested to touch? Is it that we sense that there is something alive there, that's so alive that perhaps is no longer as alive with us, and we want to touch that aliveness through them?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a fascinating element in this trace.
A little total mini divergence. Fast forwarding to today, I was looking at yesterday a photograph of a person. All of these collections of photos of the year, photos that capture this year, as we're speaking at the end of 2020 with this interview. That there was a person, a mother and daughter, hugging through a curtain. They had hung up a clothesline, a plastic curtain, and they're hugging. And, I'm looking at it. I mean, I felt touched. by it.
The context being because of the pandemic, they cannot actually touch each other, so they touch through a curtain.
Yeah. And all the things that people have done, grandparents doing the same thing, like, okay, just take this curtain down from my window so I can go hug my grandchild through it. That how healing that has been for people during this time when touch is so limited to, just the people that we live with, basically.
So catch us up through this 19th century to 20th century. How is the story evolved?
So a very significant moment that happens in the, like around 1910, where there's a man, the Flexner Report comes out, where this person, this educator, Abraham Flexner, who is from Kentucky, was hired by the Carnegie Foundation to do a report on the state of medicine in the US. And so what's going on at the time is that there's still a lot of modalities being used in medicine that we would not think of as part of medicine today. For example, homeopathy. Because at the time, medical doctors were, or we should say physicians, were still very frustrated with the fact that the medicines that they had to offer sometimes caused side effects that were just as bad as the problem itself, right? So what's the point of curing something if the cure is just going to make you suffer just the same? And so people were really still open to there wasn't a defined thing of this is medicine, this isn't medicine. And so this man went around. So it's interesting. He had been trained at Johns Hopkins University, and which followed a research method that had been. I don't know that Germany was the first place, but they certainly were sticking with it a lot. The scientific method, linking laboratory research to clinical practice, that was not a connection necessarily for everyone at that time. But the Germans made that into a very strict practice, from what I've learned from the medical historians that I've spoken with. And Flexner looked at, I think it was 115 medical schools in the US to see what was going on. Were they following these practices? These what would be considered the best practices where medicine was concerned, and found quite an array of things going on, and that most medical schools and hospitals in the country were not following these kind of strict methods that were now thought to be the most reliable for building treatments upon. The report was published in 1910, and a bunch of medical schools closed right after that, soon after that report came out, because they just were not, they couldn't adjust, they couldn't adapt. And what you find, this report really marks a turning point in medicine, where it becomes very much strictly adherent to the scientific method. All of the other things, homeopathy, light touch, healing touch, things like that, are now considered quackery, because he used that word quackery attached to those things. And I'm not saying whether they are or aren't, in my work. It's not, I'm looking at something separate. But he attaches that word, and this is when you start to find this gulf happen between practices that we would now consider wellness, and I know we'll get into that, practices that would now come under this very big umbrella of wellness, and what we would consider medicine. And they are two different things. Doctors don't call themselves healers, which is really interesting and weird if you stop and think about it. Like, I never say I'm going to the healer today. if for my routine physical, I'm not going to my healer. But why wouldn't I say that? Of course I want the doctor to heal me. So there's this kind of gulf between healing and medicine, wellness and science.
And the timing is fascinating. It's 1910. So we're coming into the rise of the momentous phase of industrialization and the rise of free market economies. And you wonder, this is the point where you can already say, follow the money. Who actually paid for his research? Right. Who actually paid for his report, and what was he actually serving? And was the report generated in service of the betterment of mankind in the broadest possible sense, or was it a report that served as a tool to advance the position and the authority of the medical practice within the strict definition of, as you describe, the empirical, clinical-based approach? And I'm not taking a point of view. I'm not judging. I'm just inquiring that this is the point where you have different professions vying for position. It is interesting that chiropractic practice started earlier in the century, in the 20th century, if I'm not mistaken, or late 19th century, and it needed to follow an interesting line to find itself approved into the mainstream, which other modalities that are further out on the edge were not able to enter that same approval, so to speak. But so how do you then narrate the story beyond that? Because we certainly see later in the 20th century, in the middle, certainly as we come to the 60s and the 70s, the resurgence of what is now not qualified as part of medicine, but people are simply asking for massage and for other approaches. People are asking to be touched in the broadest possible way, to appreciate the idea of being asked to be touched.
So in the 1960s, the World Health Organization put out a statement about wellness that was more than not being sick. That wellness was about, is your life progressing from one day to the next? And there was a few doctors that really took up that idea. And they were medical doctors. One of them was deeply involved in bringing vital statistics into something tracked by public health. I'm forgetting his last name, Herb something, I'm sorry. And there were a few others that worked with him. And they said, yes, that's right. Being alive isn't just about not being sick. And there are things that we can do to be well. And that life is moving on from one day to the next, that we are better tomorrow than we were today, and that we aren't just not sick.
That's a very important reframe of a paradigm. So from a paradigm that established itself, again, I will use the metaphor of the mechanistic view of the Industrial Revolution, where if you developed a machine and all the pieces needed to be working all right, and then there was a piece that got broken, you needed to fix the machine by replacing that piece. There was a time where human health was viewed in this way, and it was all about just return to normal operation. What you're saying is round about the mid-60s, which is very interesting for us because it converges with so many other traces in society, and with the rise of postmodernity, essentially breaking from traditional and modern views and embracing more of the holistic range of the human experience. And you're saying there is this reframe that there is below the line, do the work you need to do to come back to foundational health, but then there is above the line wellness that you can develop and has a broader definition than just your vital signs.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And we can understand, why medicine is about curing sickness, in part through even just through understanding that hospitals were originally places for the poor to go to be healed from sickness. And they were religious institutions. The first hospitals were, run by nuns. They weren't run by doctors, and they were for people who couldn't afford to have, the doctor come to their house, for example. And so, there's many avenues that lead to medicine being about bringing you, like you said, back up to your basic line of health.
Since you mentioned that aspect, I'm curious if you may not have the data point, but so there is a time where the doctor is indeed going to pay a house visit. Yeah. But there is a point where that paradigm is reversed and you come to see the doctor. Do you know that? What is the timeline? That would be an interesting data point to find.
I've looked. I've tried to find, when did house calls stop being a thing? And doctors were back in offices, but I don't know. I'm going to keep searching because I feel it must be out there. And, it's often just a matter of entering the right search terms in the medical literature system. I haven't found it yet, but I hope to. I think it would be really interesting to know, especially because, then now you get to, having your concierge doctor and boutique medicine is, bringing it back to the thing you do if you're as wealthy as can be is that the doctor comes to you.
Okay, well, so that's a segue to catch us up then from the 60s to now. What happened over the last 60 years? The premise being that with this expanding the paradigm of wellness and including in that the betterment of all aspects of the whole human experience, how is touch being re-emerging through inside that story?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it is a kind of explosion of things that happens with regard to wellness that we're all familiar with, right? So you start seeing independent wellness centers cropping up. You hear the term wellness, it's becoming a thing. Hospitals start adding wellness centers to themselves. And so essentially, there is a surge of interest in massage, in chiropractic medicine, in homeopathy, in all kinds of things that we now put under this banner of wellness. Aromatherapy, light therapy, sound therapy,
Reiki,
bee venom therapy, and lots of others that we've talked about, which you know more about than I do, Feldenkrais and other methods of touching that are quite scientific in their own right, but are not considered part of medical science. And so where do these things all find a home under the wellness blanket? And what happens with hospitals is an assortment of things. One is seeing this is something patients want. So why don't we offer it? A sort of, if you're giving the benefit of the doubt to a hospital to set, then that might be one way to look at the, the Center for Wellness attached to, this hospital or that hospital.
Well, so part of it is following what the market wants, following what patients want, and there is a part of it that is purely economic opportunism, which is perfectly right because it follows what people want. I'm interested in looking at that and asking what is it telling us, what is it teaching us, what is the perception to be gleaned in this, And one perception that I get through your telling of the story is that essentially the human race, humanity, is crying to be touched. We have become through the computing revolution, with more people sitting just behind a screen sometime for all day long as the way of their interface with the world, you have a big part of humanity that is touch deprived. Yeah. And there is a cry for touch, and the medical profession is processing, grappling with how to regulate that and how to be the judge of what's to be approved and where are the charlatans and how do we separate those from each other.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and that's, the problem now is, well, one of the problems now is, how do you deal with something that you can't measure? Because there are studies showing that people who pursue wellness modalities have shorter hospital stays and return to the hospital less often than people who don't. So what does medical science then do with that information when you cannot measure the things that people seem to be benefiting? The ways in which people seem to benefit from touch, some of it anyway can't be quantified yet anyway. It doesn't match the tools that are considered the gold standard tools.
Either that, or are we asking the wrong questions, or are we looking to measure in the wrong places, or should we find new ways to measure the immeasurable but very strongly felt?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I so agree with that, because it's what's happened is it's almost like, and again, we are not here knocking medicine, because it saves lives every day. And we live longer, and we live healthier, and we live happier on account of medicine every day, like for sure. But in this arena, there's almost a sense of having boxed itself into a corner where, well, now what? Because you have people saying, I want these things, and there's and the only thing you can do from that corner it's boxed into is say, well, it's almost like, well, you're wrong about that. You don't really want that. You think you want that, but you don't. It's just the placebo effect, and or whatever else it might be. And maybe sometimes it is, and there's reasons to care about that and to not care about that. Many people that I spoke with make really good points about, on the one hand, if there's no harm in something, then it's okay. Like, what is, doctors saying that, well, if my patient wants Reiki, fine, like it's not harmful. But then there are other perspectives where people feel that there is harm done. And part of the people who do worry about the harm worry about the things that then sit on top of that, like what you mentioned before about how one of the problems on the wellness side of things is that it's really difficult to separate out real from not real, charlatan from not charlatan. And there are people who know things about touch and all of these modalities, and there's also still snake oil there, and so that hasn't gone away. And so how do you bring your senses and your reasoning to the world of wellness, which seems to have a sort of it has kind of propped itself up to some extent on the fact that it doesn't matter if you can't measure it, because I say it's real. And that is, okay, and has its problems as well.
So then let me perhaps bring it to a concluding question, which is more inquiring about your intuition, not asking you to give us a foresight, but a sense of the future. It is interesting because you observed and you wrote how touch as a phenomenon permeates the language. Mm-hmm. And in the business world, where I often engage with, in the other side of my life, with executives who run large operations and large companies, one of the ideas in the last couple of decades obviously became the idea of touchless operation, mm-hmm. by which they mean reducing the friction as much as possible and actually eliminating human touch and transferring as much as possible the operation of a company into an automated supply chain, which is a whole other story and a whole other trace, and would be interesting to put one next to this trace, which creates wonderful possibilities and also some huge big problems, because it is removing many people's jobs away by automating those jobs. But to borrow that idea and concept of touchless, the question is, will the future be more in that direction? Are we heading to a touchless future, or are we heading into a touchful? I don't know if there is such a word, but I just made it up. A touchful future where we find a way to reintegrate touch and to reintegrate both the diagnostic and more perhaps critically, because now we have all those technological things that touch our skin and give the various readings into the cloud, and the cloud will tell us back that we are about to get a heart attack before we even got the heart attack, because it knows about us all that is about to happen. But do you imagine a future that's touchless, or do you see touch being reintegrated, or some combination of the two?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I mean, and it is a rich field for imagining what can be, and also, confronting the reality of where we are. For example, there are many places now where a routine physical is done without touch at all. No touch at all. A person sometimes doesn't even need to disrobe anymore.
Wow.
And there's people who like that, and there's people who really don't like that. And there are people who feel they're not being seen. How is this helping me if you're looking more at the computer than at my body? And there's, we didn't really go into this so much, but the level of intimacy between doctors and patients is, very real. You go to, that's the person you're supposed to be able to tell everything to. When I think of my children going to the doctor, I want, that's the person who's allowed to touch them anywhere, on their body besides a parent, like that. That's where that's the safe person. That's the safe place. You're supposed to be able to tell this person anything. And that relationship isn't necessarily like that anymore. And I think my sense is that the COVID-19 pandemic has brought us to a very fascinating crossroads where touch is concerned, and touch in medicine, because you have doctors. I heard an anecdote that my editor had relayed about the first time a doctor went back to seeing patients in person and was listening to their heart, and got tears in their eyes from that act as the doctor, not the patient. And another doctor told me about standing next to his patients who were about to undergo surgery, and how he would touch their feet. And there was no medical reason for him to touch their feet. He just wanted to. And he was saying to me how he feels like he's in a very privileged position because he can offer patients something that they really can't get very easily anywhere else right now. Someone who lives alone, how are they being touched by anyone right now? It's so painful to think about it. So it seems to me that it's almost like the human race is going to need to make a decision at some point, or maybe a decision we end up falling into it by instinct or what, about what is the place of touch in the future, and are we going to be happy removing touch so that we can have a sense of safety, or is it going to be just like, well, we're better off just not touching, even if it isn't an immediate threat to do so, or the opposite.
Yeah, or as you said earlier at the beginning, touch is one of the unique expressions of what being a human is.
I don't think it will be erased. I really don't. I just don't see it. I see the opposite happening. I see it as there's an opening now for medicine and healing to stitch themselves back up together, for this rift to not be so dire. And I have spoken with some doctors where that's happening. They're trying to do that. There's a place in the University of Texas in Austin where they've brought chiropractors onto the team. They have a masseuse on the team, and there's not a wellness center. It's not like you have to go get your touch over there. It's all as one. It's involved because it involves a restructuring of insurance, for example, but it's very good for patients because it's putting the person at the center. It's not doing what's happened in medicine of what they call fee for service, where you're paying for each thing that's done to you. Instead, you're paying to be taken care of, in whatever way that means, whatever is required.
So perhaps a landing place for us in this is these last comments you're offering, in which you are proposing a future of reintegration, where touch is reintegrated. And it may be, again, a fascinating perspective to consider this entire trace of the last 300-400 years as a trace of separation in the first place, and differentiation. But then the separation and the differentiation and the fragmentation, at some point, perhaps that is part of the evolutionary cycle that we are in, because we are seeing on completely other frontiers realms that were separated and now need to be reintegrated at a different level, at a different octave.
Yes.
And perhaps this is one frontier where this concept, this idea that we've gone through centuries of separation and fragmentations to now come into a point of reintegration. I may be offering a utopian, desirable future. I do believe the evidence is increasingly there that in our own lives. Yesterday I was doing a whole other different trace and talked about how in my work with leaders, there was a time where people talked very much about the separation between work and life, and the separation of your professional side of life and your home life. And people talked about work-life balance and how outdated that concept became early in the early 2000s, because you really needed to recognize that you were one life.
Yeah.
And the reintegration of those were another frontier where you saw in the professional arena, where people were discovering that when you reclaim your humanity in the work space, guess what? You're thriving and succeeding more. And oh, by the way, it can be a smart idea to bring some of your professional side into your relationship and into your home life because you are more proficient and less reactive. So we're seeing in different aspects of life the journey through separations and reintegrations when we trace the last few centuries. And I feel that the trace you offered us into touch is perhaps an evidence of that same meta theme in the evolutionary story.
Yeah, absolutely. It does. It certainly feels that way. And I think, if you were to look at, well, what practically is needed to make that reintegration, a little less judgment about what people do with their own lives, would go a long way toward allowing that to happen.
Perhaps we can pause this and leave that inquiry as a possible follow-up conversation. What needs to happen to enable integration? What is the development trace, the developmental, personal development, societal development, cultural development that are part of reintegration? Is a delicious premise for a follow-up conversation some other time. So thank you very much, Jessica, for this trace through time with touch.
Thank you.